Story 1. The boss and owner spent the first 2 hours severely criticizing everyone who had worked for her, past and present. I was exhausted listening to her complaints. She had nothing positive to say. I told her this was not going to work out and left. It took her a month to pay me $30, but I repeatedly followed up until I was paid. Story 2. Recruiter. This is a support position. No sales required. Interview: you will be working on our support team. Training: 3 weeks of technical training to address common issues. Day 1: shadowing with supervisor. Good work, but you did not offer the support and protection plan. Remember that informing customers about available protection plans is part of providing support. Story 3. This is one of my favorite and most embarrassing stories. I got a job at a Publix grocery store. During the interview, I was told I would work in the warehouse, which sounded fine. On my first day, I was assigned to the seafood department. I needed the job, so I went. The seafood counter was about 6 inches taller than I was. I knew what my future held there when I tiptoed and stretched as far as I could to hand a customer a fillet. I looked at the seafood manager, and he knew it too. Story 4. I was hired to work at the reception desk in a podiatry office. I watched the head nurse make the other receptionist cry over a simple mistake. The doctor who owned the practice then came out and yelled at her in front of the lobby and me, the new employee. The toxic work environment was evident, so that was my first and last day. Story 5. During onboarding, the owner asked me to sign a non-compete agreement that was absurdly broad. It said I could not work in the entire industry or related industries for a year. I was only 19 at the time and did not understand how unenforceable it was, but I refused to sign anything I could not in good faith agree to. The owner said sign it or leave, so I left. Story 6. I worked at Walgreens. I have been a pharmacy technician for 8 years, so they assumed I did not need training. The new system crashed on my first day, and they told patients it was my fault. I walked out immediately. The outage was a multi-state system crash and had nothing to do with me. Story 7. I applied to be a home health aide. I was told it would be helping elderly people with daily tasks, doing laundry and cooking. I had been struggling to find a job for months, so I immediately said yes when I was hired. I had no experience, but they assured me I would be trained and taught everything I needed to know. The training I attended was basically human resources information, how to do time cards, and other administrative details. We will train you on the job, they said. At my first assignment, a manager accompanied me and, as she knocked on the door, said, "Remember, if anyone asks, you have been doing this for 100,000 years. I did not like that, but we were already there and I hoped it would get better. I spent a few hours answering questions and going through what I was expected to do. I began to feel uncomfortable and entirely unqualified. Toward the end, the daughter listed all the requirements for the caregiver, including certifications. The manager assured her that I met those criteria, cued me to repeat what she had told me, and I mumbled something I do not even remember. On the way home, I kept thinking of all the ways things could go wrong. Immediately after I got home, I messaged them to say I would not be coming back. No, thank you. Story 8. First thing in the morning on my first day, she instantly started yelling at me. I literally had just walked in on time. After 4 more hours of her behavior, I quit at lunchtime. It was amazing how quickly her tone changed when I told her I was quitting. Fuck you, Stella. Story 9. The position was advertised as a marketing job. What it actually was, however, was a direct sales position inside a Home Depot selling bath and kitchen upgrades. A senior salesman drove me there, so I spent about 2 hours wandering through Home Depot before returning to him. He said, "I was going to take you to lunch, but it seems like you just want to go home." I said yes, and he drove me back to my car. Story 10. During the interview, the vice president said the company was a family. While showing me around, I saw a supervisor yelling and insulting a worker. I told him, "Thanks, but one abusive family is enough," and walked out. Story 11. I was hired as a server with 10 years of experience at a movie theater that serves food and drinks. On my first shift, they told me all servers had to start as food runners at $7.25 per hour for the first 6 months before being promoted to server. They also said my uniform would be deducted from my paycheck. The job listing and interview were for a server position. This bait and switch made me decline the job and leave, and I found another job almost immediately. Story 12. It was a server job. They told me it would be unpaid training shifts at first. It was not. Story 13. This was not a job offer. I had a trial shift/second interview when I lived in Edinburgh. They advertised it as a marketing job but were vague on the details. I arrived at about 7 a.m. with the other candidates, and employees in the other room were doing a loud, silly chant. They split us into two groups. Some would do the trial in Edinburgh and others in Dundee, about 60 miles away. Although I made it clear I had a shift at 2 p.m., they sent me to Dundee and said that leaving early would affect my chances. I was bundled into the back of a car next to a man who talked about his success and said he was setting up his own marketing company in the United States. I wondered what I had gotten myself into, but we were already 20 minutes down the motorway. When we arrived, they had not sent the paperwork I needed to complete. They bought me a coffee and let me fill it out in the shop before I joined them. The marketing job was actually convincing people on the street to switch energy suppliers, which they had tried to disguise to avoid scaring off applicants. I walked out and paid about £30 to get back to Edinburgh for my actual job. They could have placed me in the group that stayed in the city. Story 14. The whole thing was vague from the start. I was a college student looking for a summer job. I saw an advertisement about unlimited earning potential and an open invitation to an orientation seminar. I attended the seminar. A man in a cheap suit showed slides of Ferraris and large houses and asked if we wanted to be rich. It turned out we were expected to sell vacuums door to door. The man placed a small coupon for 2 free large bottles of Pepsi in the newspaper. People only had to call a number and agree to watch a sales demonstration at their home to receive the Pepsi. I was sent to a house with the Pepsi and the vacuum to demonstrate. The residents barely spoke English and sent me away, returning the Pepsi. I went back to the office and quit immediately. Story 15. When I was a bartender at a restaurant, a server on her first shift learned at the end of the night that part of her duties was cleaning the bathrooms. She said nah and walked out. Story 16. I was hired as a medical scribe for an oncologist. He treated his patients poorly. I was also told to expect to stay 2 to 3 hours later than scheduled every shift. I refused. Story 17. Filter Queen. I was supposed to demonstrate the vacuum in people's homes, but they promised others would book the appointments. I showed up. They handed me the yellow pages and told me to make my own appointments. No, I'm out. Story 18. I was hired as a maintenance technician but was assigned to a non-stop manufacturing line. I worked for 2 hours and said fuck this. Story 19. It was the third day on an oil field job. I had worked the same kind of job before for a different company, but this one was closer to home. My first 3 days were supposed to be in office training. At about 10 a.m. on my third day, my new boss said, around 1 p.m., get back to the hotel and get some sleep. We need you to work nights tonight. I got about 4 hours of sleep before driving an hour to start my 12-hour night shift at 6 p.m. I arrived and things were not set up correctly. There was no water hooked up, and we were low on critical supplies, just hallmarks of a disorganized outfit. I finished the shift, but not before texting my old boss to see if I could go back. As I was leaving, I learned I would have to share a rental car with a coworker and share a hotel room with the person working the day shift. My previous company had given us our own. I drove to the hotel, called my new boss and quit, returned the room key to the front desk, and drove home. Story 20. It was technically my second day. I came in the next morning to quit. On my first day, every employee warned me that the owner was a very unpleasant person. Story 21. My part-time job used to be parking cars for the local sports teams. They moved from in-house management to a third-party company. I was a supervisor with the in-house team and applied to be a supervisor with the third-party company. During onboarding, the young person who ran much of the training and would be the main supervisor was rude to everyone. I do not mind working for someone younger than I am. I have done it often, and there are many younger people I would follow. However, I did not want to work for someone who was being sarcastic and dismissive toward the new hires. When I called to ask them to remove me from the roster, they asked why. I told them in no uncertain terms that they had a human resources disaster on the horizon with that person in charge, and that if there was not already a lawsuit underway, one would begin shortly. One of my former coworkers from the previous employer did take a job with the new company and later told me that the young supervisor had been fired about a month later. I still declined to work for them. Story 22. I worked in telemarketing selling long-distance phone plans. Yes, I'm old. Get off my lawn. I quit after selling a plan to a convent because I felt terrible about it. Story 23. Summary. This was a bait and switch to recruit a bunch of independent contractors for a major satellite television service around 2005. It was advertised as a low-voltage electrical installer job, but it was not. I walked into a warehouse with 15 other people. I was told we would be doing cable and phone installation. Not too bad. I figured I would have to buy a few tools. The regional manager said we would be independent contractors and could hire subcontractors if work got busy. Red flag 1. He then said we needed to be comfortable working with 24-foot extension ladders and provide our own. Fiberglass only, no aluminum to avoid electrical shock. Red flag 2. Next, our trucks had to be stocked and kept clean, and the list of required tools was extensive. The amount of stock to carry on the truck was a lot. Red flag 3. He explained the typical hours and how many customers we needed to complete in a day. Pay was based on how many customers were finished that day, so problem installs left you vulnerable. They would also adjust your workload. If you had a week of problem installs, you might not get calls the next week. Red flag 4. Finally, we were expected to provide our own work vans. They provided a list of dealers to buy from, and you had to pay for the major satellite television service branding on the sides of the van. Red flags 5 through 100. I stayed until the end of the presentation and left immediately. Story 24. Got surprised with an 8-hour shift with no lunch break after being told I would only be doing maybe 5 hours that day. I also saw the living quarters they offered. An unfinished basement with everything crammed into a 6x9 room, and learned I would be working completely alone going forward because they said I had a good handle on it and the main chef needed a break. After my shift, I told the owner I was not going to work there and asked for my check for the day's work. I will not work for any job that tries that. Story 25. I worked in quality control at a spice factory. I was expected to eat spoonfuls of spice mixes every day to test them. I was told to drink a lot of water to offset all the sodium I would be putting in my body, but I refused. Story 26. On my first day, I was told to fax a document to a number. 2 hours later, I was called into the lawyer's office with the client on the phone yelling at me for doing so. I first checked for cameras, thinking I must be on candid camera. When I realized I was not on camera, I stood up and left. Story 27. On a collections job, the man I was shadowing asked a woman, who had a television on in the background, if it was a show on cable. She answered yes. You can pay for cable television, but not my client? She swore at him in English and Spanish. I left for lunch and never returned. Story 28. I came in to work a serving shift at a new location for a chain I had worked at for years in my hometown. I walked in expecting a typical training day, serve-safe training and other basics. Instead, the whole staff was arguing from back of house to front of house. The woman yelling in the front of house locked eyes on me, asked if I was the new server, shoved her apron and a book into my hands and walked out. I probably should have left then and there, but I had just started college and desperately needed the money. It was game night in my college town, so we were very busy, and I was also seated with a rowdy baby shower party. They were rude and seemed to be regulars. Other servers kept conversing with them but did not help. Halfway through the shift, the ceiling crumbled onto one of my tables, like cardboard. It was in their food, on their bodies, in their hair, absolutely covered. I went to the back to find a manager and could not find anyone. Only a single cook and I were back there. I asked him where everyone was and he shrugged and said they were all on a smoke break. All of them? I went back to the front of house to check on that family and my other tables and realized I was the only server waiting tables in the entire restaurant. I put my big girl pants on, barely made it through the rest of my tables without crying, told them all never to eat there again, and left without doing side work to cry my way home. When I went home to visit, I told the story to my old manager at my hometown restaurant, and he was absolutely baffled. Story 29. I interviewed for and was hired by Ruby Tuesday as a host. On my first day of orientation, they showed me around. They walked me into the kitchen, and I was horrified by what I saw. Dirty dishes were scattered across the counters. Plates of food ready to go were piled on the floor because the counters were so full. There were puddles of spilled food and drinks. I went to their break room, which was essentially a closet with a single chair and papers on the walls and floor, with sweatshirts thrown over the chair. I was completely grossed out by how much of a mess it was. I called them the next day and said I would not be coming back. A couple of months later, they were shut down for health code violations. Story 30. I got a migraine from the fumes in a plastic parts factory. I did not return to that job. I decided to go to college instead. Story 31. I worked as a cocktail waitress at a popular sports bar in my college town. It was always crowded, and ticket prices were moderately high for the time. Servers had to wait in line behind customers at the bar while the bartender made drinks for seated patrons, who might as well have stood in line themselves. There was also a much higher tip pool percentage taken off the top than at any other job I had. I finished my training shift, returned my shirt, and politely declined. Story 32. I applied for a quality assurance position in a lab. They said it would be preferable if I were bilingual, but I have no Spanish and told them this. The entire job involved communicating with people who spoke no English. It was not a good match for $14 per hour. They also lied about the shift time and had me coming in at 5 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. The job required a 4-year bachelor's degree. Story 33. I was hired as an inventory clerk, but it turned out I was unloading a semi-trailer of 50-pound manure bags by hand while wearing a shirt and tie. Story 34. I worked in a call center conducting surveys. On the first day of training, I had a meltdown on my way home and never went back. It was hell. We were expected to call people back if they hung up on us. No one hangs up on a call center by accident. They do it on purpose. Story 35. Chicken processing plant, also known as a slaughterhouse. I did not make it through the onboarding videos. Story 36. Got hired at a coffee and cereal shop. Yes, that was a thing. I had 3 years of experience with Starbucks and 2 years with a professional coffee roaster in my city. He was 80 years old and roasted the beans in the front of the house so people could watch. The cereal shop owner asked me to make him an espresso to gauge my ability. When I finished, he laughed and said, "Wow, I expected you to know more. Okay. Enjoy losing all your money and closing within 3 months." Story 37. One of my first jobs was as a barista at a local coffee shop. On my first day, I was shown where the ingredients were and asked if I knew how to make a latte. Then I was left alone in the store for over 4 hours. I had no idea what to do. I did not know how to make the specialty drinks or how to prepare any of the food. I do not remember how I got through those hours. I only recall being terrified the whole time. I walked out when the owner finally returned. I did not even want the pay for those hours. I just wanted to go home and cry. Story 38. At Kmart in the late 1990s, I worked my first overnight stocking job. A coworker told me to take one pallet and all the ones behind it and roll them out to the sales floor for the morning unpackers. He said he would be back before the shift change and left me locked in overnight with 2 non-English speaking janitors. I was 17. I rolled out every pallet he asked me to. Unfortunately, I went too far and unloaded about 10 pallets that were Christmas items. It was July. The next morning, when the shelf stockers arrived, they saw the mess. My coworker was not back yet, so I blamed it all on him and never went back. Story 39. A friend of mine took a job with an email marketing agency. On his first day, he discovered they were mostly sending spam, their internet protocol addresses were banned, and they wanted him to fix it. He quit. Story 40. Working at Lowe's as a second job after my full-time job, I was sent on break and planned to sit in my car the entire time. One of the supervisors stopped me and said I was not allowed to leave the building because my break was not considered a real break and I could be called back if they needed help. Story 41. When I was a teenager, I got a job as a prep cook at a favorite local restaurant. My first day went fine. At the end of the night, another cook asked to use my phone and I said sure, assuming he needed to call a ride. He used it for 30 minutes and called 7 different people. I was fairly sure he was on work release, so I did not go back. Story 42. I trained for 3 days at a dry cleaning business to work up front taking customers' orders. On my first official day, as soon as I arrived, my boss said I was not ready, hustled me to the back, and told me my job would be to sort buttons and sew them onto garments. I refused to sit and sew buttons for 8 hours and I walked out. Story 43. I am a bartender. I walked in for training and immediately noticed the bartender on duty was the owner, and the 4 people at the bar were his friends. They said the previous bartender had been fired because they were not receiving the free drinks the owner usually gave them. I finished the shift, and when he asked how I liked it, I said I could see why he was having trouble finding bartenders and I did not return. Story 44. Standing on concrete for 12 hours in a factory with only a 30-minute lunch and no other breaks is unacceptable. Story 45. I've only done that once. I was ordered to spray insulation without a respirator. When I quit on the spot, I was told that if I reported them to the workplace safety authorities, they would come to my house and murder me and my family. I reported them to workplace safety authorities, the police, and the local media. The man who threatened me went to jail, the company had all its licenses revoked, and I received payment for 2 weeks' wages. Story 46. Once, where I work, they hired a new employee for a retail cashier position, and on her first day things were going well. Right after she came back from lunch, the trainer said she was going to show her the evening cleanup tasks around the register and where to empty the trash cans. The new employee replied, I was hired to run a register, not to do chores. I don't do chores at home, and I won't do them here. She then handed her apron to the trainer and walked out. Story 47. I answered a help wanted ad to cut a man's grass once a week. That was the only task. After I finished, the homeowner started asking about hedge trimming, laying sod, spreading gravel, and other jobs. I told him I would not do any of that and left. Story 48. I thought I was built for tile work. I wasn't. It sucked. The boss was a friend and really needed a second man. Those tile segments wore me out completely. I made it through the job, so I didn't leave my buddy in the lurch, but I realized I wasn't tough enough on day one. The other guy was small, but he had a hidden beast in him hauling those slabs. I've done kitchen and bathroom tile work since then, but his work was on another level. The man was a slab-toting mama jamma. Story 49. It was in the 1990s in Poland. I responded to a job ad for an office clerk. When I arrived, it turned out to be a door-to-door sales job. I walked out as soon as they handed me a huge bag of products to sell. Story 50. Upholsterer and general contractor assistant. A coworker made a number of lewd jokes while we were at Home Depot, comparing a fan blowing a large sign to a blowjob. This happened about 4 hours after we started. That evening, I told him on the phone that his behavior was unprofessional and inappropriate, and I did not show up the next day. Story 51. At Sears, I quit after about an hour. During that first hour, I was supposed to be training. The manager who had been training me spent the entire hour complaining about how hard it was to get people to come into work and how nobody gave notice when they quit anymore. Saying that kids today are lazy and entitled, he echoed the familiar complaint that nobody wants to work anymore, which is not new but has only recently become a catchphrase. I excused myself to use the bathroom, grabbed my bag, and walked out. Story 52. I thought I was going in for an administrative job with a non-profit organization. They had me perform door-to-door sales. I refused and walked out. Story 53. The telemarketing went on for about 35 minutes. I hate sales pitches, and theirs was deceptive. They blasted terrible rap all day while 2 narcissists smoked by the back door. I stood up and walked out without a word. I still hate that boisterous, I can sell you anything attitude. Story 54. Sales job. He swore it was not direct sales. It was direct sales, he just called it something else. I bailed, and two other men walked out behind me. Story 55. I had a delivery driver quit about an hour into his first shift. He was a struggling writer looking to earn a little extra income. Domino's required new drivers to ride along on 3 deliveries before they could be released. I was training him, and someone tried to rob us as we were leaving the second delivery. The attacker approached the passenger side of my car after we had gotten in and the engine was running. He accosted my trainee through his open window. I drove off, but my trainee was punched in the face. He did not want to file a police report. He just wanted to go home. I assured him it was fine and left him clocked in until we closed, so he was paid for 9 hours. Story 56. Day 3 or 4. I was 18 years old and working as a server at a beach bar. A man came up and bit my shoulder. I said, "Don't do that." He replied, "Oh, is that not cool?" About 25 years ago. Story 57. I took a telemarketing job with a food company. I did not really know what it involved, but I started the next day and left at the end of the day. I was 19 and told the supervisor that my mother did not want me to work anymore. Story 58. I was at Taco Bell learning how to operate the cash register on the computer. I love Taco Bell, but when I realized I would have to smell it all day, I decided it was not the job for me. Story 59. I was inserting standard generalized markup language code into law text documents for compact discs. We needed to match the law books, so citing a page was easy. The guy next to me would not stop talking about how dumb some of these laws were. Story 60. I was going to work as a cook at an Applebee's a long time ago. I helped them with the setup and realized that almost all their food was pre-prepared. I was working at a local bar and grill where most dishes were made from scratch, so I worked 4 hours and quit. Story 61. Some time ago, on a construction job performing soil density testing in pipe trenches with a nuclear density gauge, the equipment operator nearly ran me over. I was lucky I saw him coming. I threw my nuclear density gauge out of the trench and climbed out as the operator sped by. I told them that afternoon it was unsafe and that I was leaving. A week later, one of the other workers I had been working with was buried by soil dumped from an excavator. Story 62. In college, I was recruited to be one of those people holding clipboards who stood on the sidewalk and annoyed people by asking if they had a moment to talk about the environment. I raised exactly $0 and did not return the second day. Story 63. The assistant manager handed me a cash drawer and said I did not need to count it because she had already done it for me. When I refused, she took the drawer back into the office and closed the door to recount it before I could count it. Her husband was in jail and her father-in-law was kicking her out of the house. I thought she might be setting me up because she needed cash. I walked out while she was in the office counting. Story 64. In college, a friend talked me into repossessing cars for the dealership where he worked. On the first day, they sent us into a very rough neighborhood to look for a specific license plate. We got lost. I saw a police officer on the sidewalk, so I stopped the car and stepped out to ask for directions. I must have startled him because he almost drew his gun on me. After I explained, he said we were in the right place and gave me directions. The street was littered with cars with no license plates. We started checking vehicle identification numbers, but quickly drew a crowd and decided to leave. Back at the dealership, our boss said he would find someone with a gun to go with us next time. That was it. I never went back. Story 65. I was in my early 20s when I got a job at a car wash. The owner employed a lot of young people. The day before I started, he called to explain his system of rewards and punishments, mostly punishments. Every minute you are late for work, I take $1, he said. However, I pick someone as the best worker that day, and they receive an extra $5. That level of nonsense took him about 20 minutes to explain. It was the quickest anyone ever talked me out of a job offer. I never showed up. Story 66. I had to pay for parking, frequently leave to add more quarters to the meter, and assigned parking was a mile away. Story 67. I was 16 and got a job at a shoe store in the mall. I showed up wearing a black kilt-like skirt, black tights, and a cream-cropped turtleneck sweater. My manager told me I needed to dress sexier because I looked like a schoolgirl, and that felt gross. Story 68. I sorted donations at Goodwill with no protective equipment. People donated dirty underwear. I did not return after lunch. Story 69. Someone is trying to get me to sign paperwork with a different salary than we agreed upon. Story 70. My waiter job lasted 20 minutes. I was being shown the ropes by a lovely Polish woman. She went to the back and was screamed at by the owner for 10 minutes. He called her a bitch, a cunt, useless, and several other choice words over something about a coffee pot. I walked out immediately. I am not working for that maniac. Story 71. It wasn't my first day, but I didn't last 3 weeks. I worked as a mortgage attorney for a firm that handled only foreclosure cases. In other words, the lawyer who helps a bank foreclose on grandma's house at Christmas. It was horrible. I felt like I needed to volunteer at a legal aid clinic to try to save my soul. I'm in a much better place now, helping unions with federal compliance for their workers' benefit funds. Story 72. I was hired as a busboy. When I showed up, they asked me to cut my hair, shave, and stop wearing a bracelet I had worn for a couple of years. I did not have excessively long hair, and I only had a scruff for a beard. The staff was falling apart. I ended up working 3 or 4 different positions because people were not showing up, and one person quit on the spot. That was my first training shift, and I told them the next day that I was not coming back. Story 73. I walked in on my first day for a plant operator position. I asked what the pay was, and the owner said I was rude and had the nerve to ask how much I was going to be paid. I told him I do not get out of bed for less than $40 per hour. I asked again. He said, "You will see when you get your paycheck. There is no point discussing it now. We have to see what you are worth." I started walking back to my car. He asked, "Where are you going?" I said, "You will see when you pay me $40 per hour." Story 74. When I was a young lad, my parents found me a job as a dishwasher. I hated it because everyone there treated me like trash. They assumed I was an immigrant, and that seemed to give them the right. Story 75. I was looking everywhere for a job and got an offer from Craigslist for a sales position. The orientation was held in a rented room in a strip mall and turned out to be door-to-door sales of Kirby vacuum cleaners. While we were waiting to go inside, a man about my age pulled up in a very nice car and loudly talked about making $100,000 a year doing this job. I hope no one else there accepted it. Story 76. I worked as the expediter at Chili's. Everyone ignored me and my callouts, so I left after the shift. Story 77. I was hired for a construction job. My boss tried to kiss me, so I left. Story 78. A friend of mine was interviewed and hired by an insurance sales company. On his first day of training, he discovered the role involved selling overpriced, borderline deceptive health insurance policies to seniors and quit. Story 79. I took a job at a movie theater. It was too similar to my previous food service job, and I was burned out. The schedules sealed my decision. I heard from others that part-time workers were often assigned 9 to 12-hour shifts. You could be there all day, showing up in the morning or around lunch, and not leaving until late at night or the next day. I knew instantly I would hate it and quit by email after my first training shift. I refused to subject myself to that. It was unhealthy anyway. Story 80. When I first left the military, I returned to my hometown and took a job in a slaughterhouse. They used guns that project a rod you place against a pig's head and pull the trigger. I lasted probably 2 hours and walked out. It wasn't worth $12.50 an hour. Story 81. I turned 18 and was excited. I got hired at a factory that literally hired anyone on the spot. It was a plastic molding factory that made buckets, laundry baskets, and similar items. Although this was 10 years ago, I thought, hell yeah. Decent pay but long hours. I'll be able to get an apartment on my own. The next night I went in for my first shift, a midnight shift of 12 hours, and the floor supervisor put me on a line by myself where buckets came down and I just had to put the little wire handles in the slots and put them on the pallet. I stood there for 10 minutes, looked at the clock, and felt like I might lose my mind. I told the supervisor I needed to get my inhaler from my car real quick and sped off. Story 82. I was given the wrong application forms by the manager and the wrong address for the orientation and basic training. I was told to start at a certain time, but when I arrived, I was told to begin hours later. When I started, I found I would only be washing dishes because they were short-staffed and behind. The bathroom had no light. Coworkers told me to use my phone flashlight. My schedule for the next shifts put me on days I had said I could not work because this was my second job. I took a 10-minute break and did not return. If it was such a mess just getting started, it would only get worse. Little Caesars was not worth the stress. Story 83. I worked one day at a dog boarding facility. The owner told me not to bother giving one dog his anxiety medication 3 times a day because it took too much time and the owners would never know. The poor dog lay in a pile of his own urine and feces constantly and trembled from when I arrived until I left. They also offered dog training where they boarded your dog for the first 6 months, and owners could only see the dogs twice a week starting in month 7. Those dogs were kept in the smallest cages all day and did not come out at all while I was there. Story 84. This happened back in the early 2000s. I went home for the holidays and answered an ad on Craigslist for a team to hang Christmas lights. The owner seemed cool. He ran a glass cleaning business that was dormant in winter and used the equipment to hang lights in the off-season. He paid cash, had a few vans, and everything seemed fine. The first house we went to was in an upscale suburb. It was a large 3-story house with pitched roofs. The ladders he gave us did not extend high enough to safely reach the 3rd story, and the woman insisted it had to be done. After some back and forth, she called the owner. He showed up about 30 minutes later. Before the woman could speak, he grabbed the roll of lights, climbed the corner wall of the house like a spider, and sat on the roof. He then told me and my coworker, who I had just met that morning, to grab staple guns and climb up. The customer, my coworker, and I just looked at each other with dropped jaws for a few seconds until the woman suggested we do only the first 2 stories. We finished that house, and the owner told us that most of the houses he had quoted were multi-story like that one, and that he would not always be there to hold our hands when we could not figure out how to get onto a roof. Needless to say, the other kid and I took our half-day pay and left. I searched for the man when I got home and found that he had been a professional rock climber, which explained the difference between his idea of safe and mine. Story 85. United Parcel Service expected me to load giant trucks to the brim by myself in the summer heat, in an already sweltering warehouse with no air conditioning for about $12 an hour. They expected the entire truck to be filled in 2 hours or less. What the actual fuck? When I did not show up the next day, they called to ask why I had not come in. I asked what their turnover rate was, but they would not tell me. It was slave wages and labor from a billion-dollar company. Story 86. I got a job at a gas station convenience store when I was much younger. The person training me kept yelling at me to do things without explaining how or giving me time to learn. She wanted me to handle a very busy shift entirely on my own. She did not help or jump on another register to get us through the line faster. In Las Vegas in the early 2000s, a line of people in the store at 2 a.m. was common. What broke me was that I needed to brew the coffee for the morning rush. I had never brewed coffee before because I was raised Mormon. The coffee never got brewed because I was constantly told to get back to the register, and then I was admonished for failing to do something important for the store. It remains one of the strangest experiences I have had. I now understand the trainer wanted to quit and was trying to pawn off all responsibilities on me instead of actually training me, but I did not see that at the time. Story 87. I worked at a Sonic drive-in about 22 years ago. I liked working there because I could roller skate, I received tips, and I earned a little more than the state minimum. For a job that was essentially waitressing, that was pretty decent, since waitressing jobs paid around $3 an hour if you were lucky. I had worked at that location before and applied again about a year later and got the job. It was under new management. The manager was clearly an addict with serious control issues. Since I already had another job, I was exhausted by the time I got there and not in the mood to deal with an unpredictable addict. After that first day, I was done. Story 88. I was told I could work around my school schedule. The only shifts I was given ended at 3:30 in the morning, and I had class at 7 o'clock in the morning. I told them good luck. Story 89. I went through 2 rounds of interviews for a senior sales position that included a salary for 2 months while I built my pipeline. On the first day, however, the position would be unpaid and I would have to repay the salary from any sales I generate. This is door-to-door sales, and the company does not expect applicants to have prior experience. The owner's brother said he believes every position in the United States should be 100% commission. I walked out after the free lunch. Story 90. I was told to be there early. Okay. When my shift ended, the manager said I was not allowed to leave until the restocking was done. She said, "I forgot to tell you." But I still had to do it. I finished and left. My next shift came and I did not show up. She called and I said, "Oh yes, I quit. I forgot to tell you." She lectured me about how I should have told her earlier and that she is short-staffed. My friends and I had a good laugh. Story 91. Technically, it was my third day when I walked in and quit. I had worked the current administration's first inauguration day as my second day. A customer came in yelling about rounding up and exterminating queer and transgender people. My training manager responded, "Amen, brother," and gave him a high five at the register. That same day, I was interrogated by the manager about my political beliefs and berated for refusing to answer. The next day, I put on my apron but told them it would be my last shift, saying I had been offered more hours at my other job. They waited a few minutes. Then the manager told me to leave. Panera was a terrible workplace, and I felt terrible for the Latings employees who were regularly harassed. A few months later, an intoxicated driver crashed through the front entrance. Nobody was hurt, and I still felt some satisfaction knowing how much that likely disrupted the manager's lives. Story 92. I was told I would be alone opening the next day, but on my first day, the person with me said they were too busy to train me. I learned nothing and was expected to be alone for about 3 hours the next morning. I sent an email that night saying I was done and describing how unprofessional my trainer was. Another time, I got a remote job during the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic doing over-the-phone customer service for a company that outsourced support for many businesses. During orientation, people were yelling at one another and being very rude, mostly other employees rather than the trainers. The leaders tended to give in to the rude behavior. Someone would interrupt and yell, and they would let them continue. I realized that was not for me and packed up the equipment right away. I have worked many jobs for over 5 years, so these were clearly special cases. Story 93. I started work in a place full of men. They talked down to me and acted as if I were dumb. It was a long day. Story 94. Not me personally, but to be vague. Someone was hired into my department without any of us knowing. He arrived on his agreed-upon first day while our boss was in another country, and no one knew which clients he was supposed to work with. He stood there for about 10 minutes, said, "Actually, fuck this," and walked out. I never heard from or saw him again. It has been 7 years, and I still think about him regularly and hope with every fiber of my being that he is doing well. Random guy, if you are out there, you are my hero. Story 95. Unsafe working conditions. Pulling heavy machinery on the highway that was not secured properly on a trailer. Story 96. I started training at a new restaurant. There was hair in the food, mice and cockroaches in the storage room, and waitresses putting their hands in customers' food to steal fries. I called and told the manager I would not return. Thankfully, the restaurant is now closed. Story 97. As I was shown around the factory, I was told about people who had lost body parts, mostly fingers, a toe or two, and one man who had half a foot missing. Someone thought it was funny that a man had lost an ear. I told him I had spent 9 years in the Marine Corps and still had all my body parts. Then I walked out. Story 98. I took a job in college selling magazines over the phone. It was horrible. Everyone just hung up on me. This was before cell phones, so we all sold from one big room at school desks. I left at noon, our lunch hour, and never returned. I felt bad for the people who had to stay. Story 99. I forgot who they were, but it was a marketing job I thought had something to do with sports. Instead, it involved going door to door asking people if they wanted to buy a cheap coupon book. They acted like I was missing out on a lot of cash and the opportunity of a lifetime. I sold nothing that day. Story 100. I realized it was a pyramid scam based on young people selling coupon books door to door, browbeating elderly people into buying them. I was 19, and after I saw what they were doing to an elderly woman during a sales pitch, I told her she did not need the coupon book and walked away. I found a payphone and called my father for a ride. We reported them to the Better Business Bureau that afternoon. Story 101. I applied for an administration role with an agribusiness company. It was a full-time 9-to-5 position. On my first day, they told me that on the weekend there would be a trade fair, and they needed me to volunteer to dress up as a tomato and work the fair on Saturday and Sunday. I asked if I would be paid. The answer was no. I walked out at lunchtime, got into my car, and drove home. Felt wonderful. Story 102. Back in the 1980s, I got a part-time job delivering pizzas for Round Table. They said we had to learn how to make pizzas so we would have something to do during downtime. I went in for 2 shifts. I never made a single delivery. I told them I was not coming back and they paid me out that night in cash. Story 103. I drove a cab for a day. I barely made enough to cover the cost of leasing it, and I locked myself out because my key did not fit any of the cab's doors. Story 104. I worked at McDonald's as a teenager. The manager said the infamous line, "If you have time to lean, you have time to clean," which was unpleasant. It made me realize there was not a single clean surface to lean on if I wanted to. I was there for about 20 minutes. Story 105. I worked in a call center for a week. I was told to identify myself as a merchant support representative and solicit random people to switch their card provider. Felt unethical. I never got paid. Story 106. I'll name drop. I worked for Vaughn's, and one of my higher-ups told me I could not go upstairs to get a drink of water after pushing carts in 100 degrees heat. Bye. Story 107. Before I even started, I met the new boss at Tire Kingdom and told him I would need a few days off soon after because my son was going to be born. With a straight face and an earnest voice, he asked, "Why would you want to do that?" He did not show up on the first day. Story 108. I was hired as a receptionist, a role in which I had 2 years' experience and general secretarial skills. On my first day, they told me I would also be doing electrical repair work on some of the products. It was the first time I had heard of that. I had no experience or aptitude for it, so I went straight back to the employment agency. They confirmed the job had been advertised simply as receptionist. The agency was furious on my behalf and got me an excellent job the next day. Story 109. My son quit on his first day because a coworker, in front of other employees, casually used the N-word to refer to a potential customer who had annoyed him, and no one reacted. Story 110. I was hired as a line cook and expected to work the line. I found out the only person allowed near the grills was the owner. I was told I would be doing prep, which is fine but not what I was hired for. I finished prep in half an hour because prepping fries does not take that long. I started cleaning because there was a 1/4-inch layer of dust over everything. I was yelled at for wasting time. I cleaned the fryer because the oil was pitch black. I was yelled at for wasting perfectly clean oil. I looked up and noticed the hood vents had their own ecosystem growing on them. I left. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.